Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing valvular heart disease. Okay, so in the previous video we went over this basic model of the cardiovascular system, and this model will be extremely useful when we want to discuss the major consequence of valvular heart disease, which is heart failure. However, we'll put that to one side for now, because now what I want to do is go over the in-detailed anatomy of the heart valves. So we're going to discuss valvular heart disease. We need to know something about the heart valves. So I want to go over the anatomy now of the heart valves. And the way I'm going to do this is first I'm going to draw you an anatomic picture of the heart. And then I want to discuss something called the cardiac skeleton, or the fibrous skeleton of the heart. And this is something that is present within the heart. It's part of the structure of the heart, but which not everyone knows about when they're describing the anatomy of the heart. And it's important for us to know about it if we're going to discuss the heart valves, because the cusps of all four heart valves are attached to the cardiac skeleton. So I want to discuss that before we discuss the anatomy of the heart valves. And then what we'll do is we'll go through each heart valve in turn and describe its anatomy. Okay, so to begin with then, let's do the anatomy of the heart. So I'm going to draw a picture of the heart from the anterior front. So we're going to be looking at it from the anterior. We're going to imagine we've taken off someone's anterior chest wall and we're looking at what we would see. We're looking at the heart from the front. Okay, so the chamber right at the front then is the right ventricle. So I'll start by drawing the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk coming off it here. So this is the right ventricle, like so, with the pulmonary trunk coming off up there. And I'll just label this up. This is the right ventricle, like so. Now, above the right ventricle, you'll then have the right atrium, which will be here, and you'll have two blood vessels coming into the right atrium. Here is the superior vena cava, or the SVC, and below, like so, here's the inferior vena cava, so this is the IVC. And even though it looks as though the IVC is draining into the right ventricle, it's just behind the right ventricle and it is draining into the right atrium up here. So this is the right atrium. Right, so the next chamber that I want to put on is the left ventricle. So next to the right ventricle here, this is where the left ventricle will be, like so. And the main output of the left ventricle is going to be the aorta. Now the left ventricle actually goes behind the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is only at the front. Behind it you actually have the left ventricle. And the left ventricular output actually comes out up here, behind the right atrium. And so you have to understand that the right heart isn't just to the right of the left heart, it's actually also slightly in front of the left heart. So the left heart actually goes behind the right heart. And for this reason, the aorta, the main output of the left ventricle, is actually to the right of the pulmonary trunk, which is the main output of the right ventricle. That's something that always confuses people. So I will put this on here. Here, this is the aorta, coming out like so. So this is the main arterial output, which is the aorta, and then the right atrium, its top is there. So the aorta is coming out behind the right atrium. Here's the right atrium. Behind the right atrium is the top of the aorta, which is coming out of the left ventricle, which runs behind the right ventricle, and also there's a bit of it here to the left of the right ventricle. Okay, so that's the that's the aorta. Now I'll just finish off the pulmonary trunk here. I'll show it bifurcating into the two pulmonary arteries. So there's the pulmonary trunk, like so. This is the pulmonary trunk portion, and then it's bifurcated, and this is the left pulmonary artery, and this is the right pulmonary artery. Of course, the left pulmonary artery will be going into the left lung, and the right pulmonary artery will be going into the right lung. Okay, right. Finally, just to complete it up, we need to have the left atrium shown. So here is the top of the left ventricle, and then I'll put on the left atrium here, and of course the left atrium is going to have blood vessels coming into it. So I'll put these on like so. So this here, this is the left atrium. And these blood vessels coming in, these are the pulmonary veins, and there are actually 4 of these. I've only shown the left pulmonary veins here, which are both coming from the left lung. But there are 2 more, which are the right pulmonary veins, and they'll be coming in on the opposite side, but they'll be behind everything, so we won't be able to see them. So these are the left pulmonary veins here, coming into the left atrium. Okay, and that's everything now shown. Here is the right atrium with the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava coming into it, and we're looking from the front, so I've not shown the connection between the right atrium and the right ventricle because you can't see that that's inside, but there would of course be the connection with the tricuspid valve in between them. Here's the right ventricle with the pulmonary trunk, and I'll just label up the pulmonary trunk. That's the one vessel on here that I haven't labelled, so this is the pulmonary trunk splitting into the 2 pulmonary arteries. So this bit here is the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so there's our anatomical picture of the heart then. What I now want to discuss is this thing called the fibrous skeleton of the heart, or the cardiac skeleton. Now, before we do that, let me just talk about the structure of the heart wall. So what are the layers of the heart wall? And we'll do this starting from the inside and working outwards. So, the inner part of the heart wall is of course lined by endothelial cells, just like the rest of the blood vessels. All blood vessels are lined by endothelial cells, and the heart is effectively part of the circulatory system, and therefore too is lined by endothelial cells. Now, the name for the endothelial cell layer, along with the connective tissue underneath it, that's part of the heart wall, is the endocardium. So just to make this absolutely clear, you can imagine that we are taking a little bit of the left ventricular wall here. I've drawn a little box around there. We're cutting a little bit out, and we're now having a look at it under the microscope, and we're having a look at the different layers. So the innermost layer then is made up of endothelial cells sitting on a basement membrane, as always. So here they are. Here's an endothelial cell. Here's another endothelial cell. And here will be the chamber where the blood is. So we'll have the blood here, and these are endothelial cells, which I'll just for short abbreviate to ECs. So ECs is standing for endothelial cells. Right, underneath the endothelial cell layers, the endothelial cell layer, there is a basement membrane on which they are sat, which is a connective tissue layer, which is very rigid, and that's the support for the endothelial cells. This is the reason the endothelial cells don't just fall off into the chamber, they're attached to this basement membrane. So here, in red, this is a BM, which stands for basement membrane. Now, that we would still just call the endothelium. So an endothelium consists of not only the endothelial cells, but also the basement membrane on which the endothelial cells are sat. Now I want to go on to the layer underneath that, which is another connective tissue layer, and all of this is still endocardium. So underneath the basement membrane you have a connective tissue layer, which I'm doing now here in this pale green colour, I suppose it is, and all of this layer, the endothelial cells, the basement membrane on which they're sat, and the connective tissue underneath that, all of this is what we call the endo, meaning inside, cardium. So this is the layer of the heart wall that's most on the inside. Now, that's not, of course, the most famous layer of the heart wall. The most famous layer is, of course, the muscle cell layer, and that's what's going to be next up. So, outside of the endocardium, so we've gone past the endocardium now, we have the big, thick layer, and this is going to be shown out of proportion. It will be much thicker, but actually I could get some more space. I can just do this, so I can show it more in proportion. So we're going to have a massive, great, thick layer of cardiac muscle cells. So I'll just put some of these in. So here is a cardiac muscle cell. Here's another cardiac muscle cell. Let's have another one here, etc. And you can make a little brick pattern if you like. So these are the cardiac muscle cells. So I'll just label them up. They are cardiomyocytes if you want to be lazy and just have one word for them. So cardio means pertaining to the heart. Myocytes is a muscle cell. So muscle cells of the heart. And they do have nuclei, so I'll just give them nuclei, like so. So this great big layer of the heart wall, the muscle cell layer, this is the myocardium, and of course this is the layer that's responsible for the heart being able to contract, because all of these cardiomyocytes can contract, they can reduce their length, and when all of them do, that will reduce the circumference of the heart wall effectively. If you imagine the heart wall goes all the way around here, if all of those shorten, it's going to mean that the whole thing has to pull inwards, because that's the only way it can get shorter. So it will contract down the chamber inside the heart. Okay, so this is the myocardium portion of the heart wall. So we've had the endocardium, then the myocardium, and then outside of the myocardium, you then have the epicardium. And the epicardium is basically just the mirror image of the endocardium. So you have some connective tissue, like so. And then you have a basement membrane with mesothelial cells on them. And these are again going to be squamous. These are the cells of the visceral pericardium. And if you remember embryologically, they come from a different layer to the endothelial cells and all the other epithelial cell layers. I believe that is the mesoderm. They come from the same portion of the embryo as the cells that line the pleura, the pleural cavity, so the visceral and parietal pleura, and also the peritoneum. So this is the pericardium. But firstly, let me just put the basement membrane on. So again, in the thick red here, here's the basement membrane. And then sitting on top of that, let me have my... Oh, whoops. I forgot to go thin again. And then on top of that, here we have, again, these squamous cells like so, but this time you wouldn't call them endothelial cells, you wouldn't even call them epithelial cells. Instead, they are given this rather glorious title of mesothelial cells. And that reflects the part of the embryo they come from. And my embryology isn't quite as good as it once was, but I think they come from the mesoderm layer. Hence, it would make certainly sense for them to come from the mesoderm layer, with them being called mesothelial cells. Okay, so this portion here, this is what we would call the epicardium. However, it has another name. You can also call this the visceral pericardium, because that's what it is. It's the visceral pericardial layer. And then, of course, there will be a space, which is the pericardial space, and then you'd have an outer layer, which is equivalent, just like this, a basement membrane with mesothelial cells lining it, which will be the parietal pericardium. So this is the visceral pericardium. So these are the walls of the heart. These are the layers of the heart wall. Here's where the chamber of the heart is, where the blood would be. We've got the endocardium, the muscle cell there, and then surrounding the outside, we've got our visceral pericardium, which consists of a connective tissue there, and then this mesothelium here. And then what you'd have, and I might just complete it up for completion, you'd then have a space, which is the pericardial cavity. So you'd have the pericardial space, and I'm going to over-exaggerate this completely, just because I don't want to have to rub out the mesothelial cells there. So, and then what you'd have is the parietal pericardium, which would consist again of a basement membrane, like so, with and I've done it again, get rid of that, with mesothelial cells here. So here's a mesothelial cell, oops, here's another mesothelial cell, turn that into the nucleus, etc. And then underneath that you'd have a bit more connective tissue just to make it a little bit more thicker, like so. And then that will be the outer wall, like so. Okay, so this here, this would be the parietal pericardium. Okay, but this of course isn't a layer of the heart wall, I'm just making it complete so that we've got a description of the pericardial sac as well. Right, so this is the bit I'm interested in us knowing. These three layers, endocardium, myocardium, and epicardium. Now, why have I bothered telling you this? Well, it's because I want, when I describe the cardiac skeleton, you to know where the cardiac skeleton is actually placed. So it's going to be amongst the myocardium layer, at a certain layer of the heart. So this is what the wall of the heart looks like for most of the heart. If you take a sample from the left ventricle over here, you'd get this. If you take a sample from the right ventricle down here, you'd get this. So most of the places you go to, the heart wall will look like this. However, if you go to a specific part of the heart, you find a very strong connective tissue structure in the myocardial layer, and it's this layer here. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to take a transverse cross-section through here, and you'll notice that if we take this transverse cross-section here, what are we actually going to go through? We're going to go through, and I'm going to actually draw it on. So here in the red pen, in fact I'll go for a different colour. We'll use blue, we haven't used that for a while. Here in the blue pen, this is where we're going to take this cross-section. So what are we actually going to go through if we do this cross-section? We're going through the junction between the right atrium and the right ventricle, the junction between the left atrium and the left ventricle, the junction between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and even though you can't really see it, the junction between the left ventricle and the aorta is at that level as well. We're going through where absolutely all of the 4 heart valves are. At this level, there is going to be a lot of connective tissue in the myocardial layer, and it's all going to be connected to one another to make this set of rings at this level, which is called the cardiac skeleton. So don't worry if you don't understand yet. I am nowhere near finished explaining this yet. So we are now going to discuss the cardiac skeleton, and it's also called the fibrous skeleton of the heart. So the cardiac skeleton, or you can call it the fibrous skeleton of the heart. Okay, so how am I going to show you this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to imagine we actually have taken that cross-section. I'm going to draw out what the heart would actually look like if we took a cross-section like that. And this will nicely illustrate to you how much in front of the rest the right ventricle is. Okay, so we're taking this cross-section. The way I'm going to orient it is at the top here we're going to have the front, at the bottom we're going to have the back, this side we're going to have the right, and this side we're going to have the left. So I think that's a reasonably intuitive way to orient everything. And I'll do it in white again. So let me try and make this as good as possible. So here is the right ventricle out the front of everything else. And then the rest of the heart comes back like this. Okay, so this is actually the shape of the heart, roughly, when you take a cross-section like this. So I have literally just cut this through. Here is the right ventricle at the front here. This is also going to be right ventricle, and on top of this you'd have the right atrium. And this portion is going to be the left ventricle. Now, because of the incredible level that I have cut through this, I'm actually going to see the junction between the right atrium and the right ventricle, the left atrium and the left ventricle, the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle and the aorta, and that's what I'm now going to draw on here. So starting with the junction between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, which of course will be right at the front. So here is the hole, which is the connection between the right ventricle and and the pulmonary trunk. And by the way, we're looking as though we're from the top downwards is the way that I'm orienting this. It's an exact opposite of CT scans. We're imagining we're looking from looking from the top downwards. So I'll spell it out exactly. We have taken a knife and cut through here. We've taken the top off, and we're now looking from the top. I'm imagining I'm up here looking down, and this is the front, this is the right, this is the left. So I hope that's clear. So here is the pulmonary trunk coming out at the top. Then we'll have the hole for the aorta just behind, like so. And also you can see it's to the right. Oh, and sorry, I've told you the orientation of this wrong. This is right and this is left. I told you this was right and this was left, I think. So this is right and this is left. Right. Okay, so we can see that the aorta here, where the aorta is coming off, that's slightly to the right, and that's exactly what we suspect, because look, the aorta is coming off slightly to the right of the pulmonary trunk, and behind also, that's what you see. Now let me put on the junction between the right atrium and the right ventricle, which is going to be like this here. In fact, let me just redo that. I want to make it slightly smaller. Okay, that I think is slightly better. And of course you can look up these pictures on Google. If you type in cardiac skeleton, you'll get a picture just like what I'm drawing here. And then finally, let me put in the junction between the left atrium and the left ventricle, which is here. And you'll notice that the junctions between the atrium and the ventricles are much larger than the junctions between the ventricles and the arterial systems. Okay, right. So we've gone through the myocardium effectively here. Remember what we've done? We've cut through here, and we are now seeing this is a chamber. This is all the wall of the heart now. In amongst this wall of the heart, you are going to have thick connective tissue, such thick connective tissue that it forms a strong structure on its own, which is called the cardiac skeleton. And these layers of connective tissue are going to surround these outlets and inlets, depending on what you want to look at them as. Okay, so these junctions, let me now show you this. So I'll stick to my white pen. So this connective tissue structure then looks like this. So all of this is going to be connective tissue, and as I said, the reason that I wanted to show you the layers of the wall of the heart is to make you understand that this is going to be where the myocardium is. It's going to be in the equivalent layer to the myocardium. It's going to replace the myocardium at this level in these positions that I'm showing you. So this will come like this, and then all around here, like so. Okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do to make it slightly... Oh, actually, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to modify this picture later on. So remember, this, and this. These are the actual chambers of the heart. Everything else is the wall of the heart. All of this bit that I've now shown you here, all of this, and I'm now going to colour it in a certain colour. We'll have it in... what colour would connective tissue suit? I'll have it in this yellowy colour. Mustard colour, I think. All of this space here, this is all going to be connective tissue. And it's going to be a really dense band of connective tissue. Okay, imagine like a tendon. It's very, very strong connective tissue structure within the heart. And this is what we mean when we say the cardiac skeleton. There is this structure made up of these multiple rings of connective tissue around these outlets / inlets that are fused together effectively, and this is called the cardiac skeleton. So this thing in mustard, this is the cardiac skeleton then. Right, so let me just tell you a little bit more about the cardiac skeleton. So clearly what we've got here is 4 rings of connective tissue that are fused together, and these rings are around these inlets / outlets, these junctions between atrium and ventricles, and these junctions between ventricles and arterial systems. And these are the things that the cusps of the heart valves are going to be attached to. So the leaflets, the little bits that flap around of the heart valves, these are going to be attached to these very strong connective tissue rings. So some terminology then. Each of the rings obviously has a name, and because this was all created long, long ago, you don't just use a ring, you use annulus. So let me give you an example. This one here is the pulmonary trunk. This is the one for the pulmonary trunk. This is the pulmonary trunk outlet here. So you would call this the pulmonary annulus, the pulmonary fibrous annulus, if you're being precise. So this is the pulmonary fibrous annulus. So you don't call it a ring, you call it an annulus, which is an old word meaning ring. Okay, equivalently this one's for the aorta, so this would be the aortic fibrous annulus. This would be the right atrioventricular fibrous annulus, and this would be the left atrioventricular fibrous annulus. Or you could call this the tricuspid valve fibrous annulus, and this one the mitral valve fibrous annulus. Okay, so that's the first piece of terminology. Then I want to tell you about the fibrous trigones, because you'll often hear people talking about the fibrous trigones of the cardiac skeleton, and you might not have a clue what they're going on about. So just whilst I've got the opportunity to teach this, I will teach you this. So we also talk about the portions of the cardiac skeleton called the fibrous trigones, and there are two of these, and you might actually even be able to see where these are. So we have these portions of connective tissue, one here, and I'll do it in a different colour. So in the cardiac skeleton, you have this triangle of connective tissue here. This is one of the fibrous trigones, and you also have this triangle of connective tissue here, which are formed when these annuli of connective tissues are fusing together. And these are known as the fibrous trigones. So of course we have the right and left fibrous trigone. So this one is the left fibrous trigone, and this one is the right fibrous trigone. And there are old, hideous Latin names for the right and left fibrous trigones. Trigonum fibrosum dextrum, I think, is the right fibrous trigone, and the left one's even worse. I can't remember what the Latin word for left is, but again, it will be trigonum fibrosum and then some word for left. So if you see that, just translate it into the English, fibrous trigone, either the right or the left one. Okay, so this is the left fibrous trigone and this is the right fibrous trigone. And that's really all there is to say about the cardiac skeleton. This structure is sitting at the equivalent layer to the myocardium in these positions. So instead of having myocardium in these positions here, you would have this connective tissue layer instead. You would still have an endocardium inside of this. So inside of this white layer, you'd have the endocardial layer, and then you'd have big, thick connective tissue layer, and then outside of that, you'd have myocardium, and then epicardium outside of that. So this is what we mean when we say the fibrous skeleton of the heart. Oh, and there is actually something more I need to say. This picture that I have drawn for you is a little bit oversimplified. It's correct for the atrioventricular annuli here, fibrous annuli. So both the left atrioventricular fibrous annulus and the right atrioventricular fibrous annulus, they're drawn fine. But these ones for the pulmonary and the aortic junction, they're a little bit simplified in my picture. They're more complicated than this because they are not just a ring of connective tissue in a nice shape. They are a more complicated shape than this. So the way I've drawn it is like this. They would be rings of connective tissue, and I'll draw them now as a 3D picture in this sort of shape, flat rings of connective tissue. Unfortunately, that is not actually the way they are. They're more complicated than that. Instead, they have these bits which go up. So I'm trying to think how I can do this because it's difficult to draw. So imagine if I cut this sort of a ring of connective tissue, what I'd have is a straight line like this. If I unfolded it, I'd have a straight line like this. These rings of connective tissue, the aortic fibrous annulus and the pulmonary fibrous annulus, they are not like this. Instead, they would be like this. This would be the ring of connective tissue, and then what you need to do is connect this bit to this bit, and then imagine that as a ring, and I will try and now draw it. You'd have it sort of like, oh, I've already gone wrong, I think. So it would have to go round like that and then up like this. So yeah, this is why I didn't want to draw this in the first place, because it's very difficult to actually draw this. I'll continue trying though. Okay, the best way for me to explain it is this picture here. Take this and connect that to form a ring, and you get something that looks like a crown with just 3 of these little bits on it. And that's what these are actually like. They are still a ring of connective tissue, but it's not just a flat ring of connective tissue like this. It's like this, or like this, put round. And I also want to stress that, look at the way I've done this. It's not as though it's not a thing of connective tissue like this, where you've just got these spikes. No, it's instead, and I'll try and redraw this now, it's instead like this. So there are the spikes again, and the connective tissue goes up like this. So this is the structure of these aortic and pulmonary fibrous annuluses. Take this, fold it round, connect that to that, get a ring with these 3 horns, but it's not as though the horns have it all filled in. They go up and down, so they're just as thick as these bits down here. They're not much taller. Okay, right. So to try and rectify my picture and show you where these bits where it goes up are actually going to be, I'll take this yellow pen. So let's start with the aortic fibrous annulus. You're going to have one of these spikes, and in fact, let me give you the fancy word for these spikes. These fancy spikes have names. They're known as the commissures. So when we're talking about the aortic and the pulmonary fibrous annuli, we talk about these bits where the fibrous connective tissue goes up as the commissures. And the reason that you have these commissures will become apparent when we see the structure of the semilunar valves later on. These are actually key to the structure of the semilunar valves. Okay, so let's start off with the aortic one here. So the aortic one is going to have a commissure here. It's also going to have a commissure here and a commissure, at the front there. The pulmonary one is going to have a commissure here as well, and those 2 commissures will coincide. Imagine the fibrous connective tissue coming up and then going back down again. They coincide perfectly. And then the pulmonary one here will also have 2 commissures at the front, like so. One on the one on the left and one on the right here. Okay, so these are the commissures of the pulmonary and aortic fibrous annuli. So it might confuse you a little bit looking at this bit here, because I told you that the atrioventricular fibrous annuli were flat, and now look, we've got a flat bit here and then it is a commissure up there. You have to be quite good at visualizing here, because this is going to turn into the commissure as it goes from here to here to here. So imagine this bit's flat, and then at this side it has to be arched like that. It's going to gradually go up to that. So it gradually turns from being flat to being like that. Hopefully your power of visualization can cope with that. And the same is going to happen here. It's going to be flat here, and then it's going to go into this arched shape. So you're going to imagine a smooth transition from the flat to being arched over here in that commissure. Okay, so it is complicated to understand the structure of these fibrous annuli surrounding the pulmonary and aortic outlets. I would advise that you go onto Google and type in cardiac skeleton, and you'll get these beautiful pictures of the fibrous skeletons, and you might even get pictures which have been taken where they've taken all of the rest of the heart away and you've just now got the fibrous skeleton left, and that will hopefully convince you of how this thing, it's strong enough to survive, to be present after dissection of the rest of the heart away. It is a reasonably strong structure, and it's the structure that all of the heart valve leaflets are going to be attached onto. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll have a break here. In the next video, what we'll do is we'll start our discussion of the heart valves anatomy, and we'll start by looking at the tricuspid valve, then we'll go on to the pulmonary valve, then the mitral valve, and then the aortic valve. So we'll go through them in order. And hopefully, if you're still a little bit confused about the structure of the cardiac skeleton, hopefully it will all make sense why these commissures are here in the pulmonary and aortic fibrous annuli once you've actually seen the structure of the semilunar valves, because the semilunar valve structure makes this make sense. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.